All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at several several different designers' approaches to many different designers. A lot different than what we looked at in the lecture in class. And we're going to look at both the grid structures that they used, and we'll talk about the design, the capturing of the designer's style and of basic design magazine or publication design techniques. So this first designer, and I apologize for starting with a very advanced grid. This would be a hierarchical grid, and they're difficult to control because there's a lot going on. It's also an informal grid in that it's not divided equally mathematically. And I apologize for the little bit of the abstract narrative. I'm still sick, and so I'm not completely coherent. But anyway, so this designer has chosen to use Saul Bass's. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that it was nice that he started with a cover page to the project. That's always a neat idea because it kind of sort of sets the tone, gets the idea of what was going on in the project, and it also provides an introduction. Okay, so anyway, Saul Bass is his particular designer, and you can see how he used this hierarchical grid. It's not as though it divides the space completely organized, but it divides the space in a consistent manner. You can see how, in a situation like this, he used the hierarchical grid primarily for finding delineations for imagery and for text. So it works nicely. Look at his little folios are picking up, right down here are picking up the style. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at the not grid version. And again, you can see how his hierarchical grid is used to break up content and to organize things. It feels very nicely done. It holds together well, and it shows that it doesn't have to be formal to make it work. As well, this is an active grid in that he's adhering exactly to the grid structure, and so that works nicely as well. Here again, seeing the spacing of the three elements. The hierarchical grid provides that opportunity for that even spacing, so that worked out very well. So anything else about the grid? Notice the columns he justifies as text. That works very nicely when you're dealing especially with narrow columns. But once you set that standard up, it's usually a good idea to maintain it throughout the design. So I think that's all for the grid. So getting to the grid off, notice the typo right here, cohesive. So be careful of that kind of thing. If you're going for a portfolio piece, people who are looking at your work will jump all over obvious typos, and it will definitely cut into your credibility as a designer who has a good attention to detail. So with the grid off, you can see how nicely the spaces work. It's not as though it feels too structured or organized, but it feels really, open and still yet very organized. He picked up the style of Saul Bass, who had a very sort of a loosely illustrative style. He did a lot of hand lettering, and that was one of his styles. He did a lot of work, obviously, but that was one of the things he's famous for. Especially did a lot of movie posters, and I don't know if he picks up on that. Yeah. In his third spread, he looks at that style, and Saul Bass actually did a lot of movie posters, a lot of James Bond posters and that kind of stuff, and his style was very prominent in that at that time. So now the grid, as you can see, holds together really nicely. He picked up on the idea of these black bars. Okay, so that was one of the things that he thought, okay, I'm going to do black bars, and I'm going to do my folios with little black polygons. So as he picks up through this, the black bars come in, and also his text starts to play around inside of those. Columns work really well. And so, again, kind of picking up on that style, even though there were some ideas going on there. And then as this continues, again, the titles inside the black bars as graphic elements leading into some text. The folios pick up the black backgrounds on the graphics. The initial caps that were picked up from the initial page all worked very nicely. And same thing here. Again, these are continuity elements picked up on some of the graphic elements of his style. Picked up a list as a graphic element. A little call out right here, which worked nicely. Again, he did a lot of logos, and so those were kind of cool because they are stylistically very different. But that was his way. I mean, he was a very developed designer. Okay, that's Saul Bass. Let's look at Neville Brody. This case, this was a column design, an asymmetrical grid, no horizontal rows, and so it had a lot of flexibility in where things are placed in that vertical format. Now, that being said, it can cause trouble in terms of the continuity, because elements will start to float in the vertical structure, or I should say the lack of the vertical structure. But Neville Brody, we'll talk a little bit about his style here in a minute. These were two different versions of the grid on, and in this case kind of pulling the text up to the outside edge and bleeding. So that's kind of a neat idea. Again, we'll talk a little. I don't think that was the selected design. So again, we see the columns are, again, it's an active structure, and decided to bring in the columns from the inside, but it's consistent all the way through. So even though the text doesn't go all the way out to the edge of the column, the placement is consistent. Again, picking up on the idea of a common graphic element, a little quote mark around each one, using the designer's profile in a different way, picking up on the graphic elements that he did. He was a very typographically edgy designer, and so his work definitely showed that. So here, the third spread with the grid on, and picking up on the addition of the red bar as a graphic element, turning that into a continuity element. Pulls down from the edge over there, right? And from the bottom over here. Picked up on an idea of a bracket around some imagery. I don't know if that picked up at the beginning. No, it didn't. So that was something she added as an element as the spread started to evolve. And in the third spread, we see that that bracket come back. This would have been something that would have been fun to bring up again as a graphic element for continuity. In the third spread, she added a new sort of layout concept. That's something, again, that I think would have been helpful to pick up in a little bit earlier on. Even though this is sort of that same style, which picked up from the beginning, one of the things you want to do, or think about at least, is once you've got the name of the designer out there, you don't really need to bring it back. We already know who Neville Brody is, so bringing a graphic back like that is kind of a waste of time and a waste of content, especially when we're very much a media culture where we are bored when we see something twice or more. So think about that as you do your layouts and your designs. Okay, so then we talked about this. Here, this is a typeface in a black box. It would have been nice to see a black box introduced somewhere as well. So in this case, this designer added actually four new elements to the third spread. And so normally you would not want to do that. Maybe one or two possibly. But if you're going to add graphic style, you'd want to introduce that at least in some way early on. Like even this idea of the type overlapping would have been fun to introduce that somewhere in here. I don't know how. I mean, I'm just making some comments on what I see. This is a good example of the kind of type that he did. He was very edgy and one of the very first edgy typographic designers, and he also was influenced a lot by Dada and by constructivism. So that's Neville Brody. And our next designer is Alexei Brodovich. And this designer chose to use a baseline grid with column structures. And you can see the column structures are not consistent. So this is a little advanced and maybe not even particularly a good idea, because it's not going to provide continuity between the pages. And so, but the idea of the baseline grid forces you into the idea of holding that design all the way through. So it really forces your text to follow the baseline, forces your headlines to follow the baseline. And in this case, the designer's sort of loose approach to the layouts, it works because there's not a lot of content continuity between the pages. So in her case, I think it worked pretty well. So, I mean, if you were to take a look at these designs, and this is always a neat way to see if your grid's working, is to take it and then work through it very quickly and sort of see if there's continuity, and if so, where. So in this case here, where skills and life, they're off a little teeny bit, and so those are the kinds of things that grids are supposed to fix. And so that is a thing that you want to make sure your continuity is there. So so it was nice. You used a lot of background graphics, but again, here's a situation where she did too many layouts. Obviously, there's 5 spreads here, which is more than you were technically allowed. But she did a nice job with it, so I'm not going to get all crazy about it. But still, I think the idea of maintaining that, your editor says you got 3 columns. You got 3 spreads. You got 3 spreads, so that's pretty much what you get. Here, the idea, she's held together very nicely in the first 3, and she could have killed it right there. Then she adds a background graphic, and the images get small and sort of detailed, where before she's got big, bold images on the pages. The typography is consistent throughout, and then it really kind of breaks away from that in these last 2 spreads. So in actuality, she probably could have simply not done those last 2. So here is, I think I've got her design someplace without the grid on. Here's another design, very nicely done, Terry Davis. Again, a title sheet and her design reflection statement is also included in the package. And I think that's, again, always a good idea. Her folios are kind of fun. Use these little bubbles. The artist is Thompson Bradbury, and Bradbury Thompson, I'm sorry. And she picked up on some of the work that he did, including color, and kind of used that color throughout the design. Picked up on the yellow bar as a typographic element, the little bubbles as a continuity element in the folios. Picked up on the colors in the type, so that's always kind of fun. The little quote marks are also, a neat approach. And then, noting that he did use a lot of bright colors, but very carefully, that's where she picked up on the design element for her layouts. Then she played around a little bit with pull quotes and also with call-outs, and so that worked out nicely. It would have been nice, this is the only pull quote, which is also a block quote. It would have been nice to literally pull that out and put it within the layout as a graphic element instead of just as a block quote. It works though. The design is very tight and laid out, and as we've seen, in some of the designers, they really tried to capture the essence of the designer's style, and some have gone more with the traditional magazine layout, just talking about the designer and using graphic elements to sort of pick up on the style of the designer. My preference is to be a little bit more edgy on it, try and pick up a little bit more of the style of the designer. Here's the grid, and the grid itself is a formal grid. 5 column and like 8 rows or 9 rows. It's nicely stratified. I don't think this is this grid's too complex. And I think it adds a lot of potential in terms of where you put things. She chose to make this grid an active grid, which is appropriate for this kind of grid. So even when something breaks out of the grid, it holds into three of the spatial zone perimeters. So that's the important part of using a formal grid. If it doesn't fill perfectly, it should fill at least 3. It should touch at least 3 sides. In some cases, where she uses the let's see, I don't think she does that here. No, she's pretty consistent with that. There's another designer who handled the alleys or the gutters, as people are more and more tending toward. She adhered to that very, very strongly. So again, taking a look at how the design worked without the grid, if you just go up and down, you can see how the continuity, notice the top line is consistent up there, and there's a column here that works right in there. So it's a pretty decent design in terms of using the grid in a continuity manner, but there are some issues with it that could have been stronger. Let's see. I'm going to look at Ivan Chermayeff, and this designer was iconic, totally iconic. Did all kinds of stuff in all kinds of media, and also did illustration, and this was one of his illustrations. Pulled a pull quote with the quote marks black and white, which is kind of cool. So she's picking up on this black element, and that's where she's going to use. That's what she's going to use as continuity. A very playful typographic treatment, and many of you have typography in your skill set. I'd like to see some work like this where it's got, where you're playing around with hierarchy and with weight and alignment and so on. So it was a pretty cool layout. And here again, this is with the grid on. And gosh, I sure do hope I got the one after this. And so again, the grid's very tight. Um, let's see. It's a formal grid, right? And it's got the binding edge here in the middle. So the grid is basically a rectangle inside of the page. And used somewhat, I'm not sure how this has worked. I'd have to measure it out. But you could call it a formal vertical grid and then a semi-formal horizontal grid. I don't think this is any specific division of space, though, like I said, I could be wrong. So as she works through the design, you can see how she's used the grid. That's the neat thing about using narrow columns. You can do some fun things. In her case, this is the example I was thinking about, where these are the alley gutters, right? And in this case, she chose to use the outside edge of the alley instead of the inside edge, right? And so that can create some neat effects. But by the same token, in this situation, it could create some, it might have been better to use this alignment and not do that, because there's nothing else picking it up. We'll talk a lot about this in the next project in terms of deciding what elements or what grid lines to use, because you're not going to use all of them, obviously, but they're there. But picking up and then deciding what's going to be your continuity, that's important. So let's see here. So this is a line she chose as a flow line. Okay, everything, drops either below it or above it. And so if that's the line, that didn't really pick up on anything. This is the line here. So it's not like you have to pick that up right away, but once you start with content, you can see how she's used that to align text and part of the subheadline. Even though this image does violate that, it's not as though it's really a horrible violation. You can see these two spreads hold together very nicely. Again, I'd still be looking for more strong vertical alignments. It tends to sort of float around a little bit. But that's partly because she chose to use the left spread for all the body text on that, and then the right page for the body text there. Is that important? It can be. I don't know why her body text is highlighted here, but here's a situation where she would have benefited from a baseline grid, because what happened here with her paragraph breaks, it starts to take those text lines and they start to become unaligned, and that's really an issue. Okay, you see how that becomes really unaligned there, and it doesn't even hold together here. So the important thing is that if you're going to have a line break for a paragraph, the line break has to be the same break as a line of text, so that the next paragraph starts at the next line. So it's really very important. As well, there's a lot of problems with her typography in that she has an orphan here, an orphan here, an orphan here, almost an orphan here. That's 2 words, but it'll work. And so we'll talk about adding tracking to your lines of text to kind of create to stop that from happening, because those are really considered real no-nos. And again, if you're showing this design to a person in a portfolio review, they're going to pick up on that, and that's something they'll really like. Hey, you got those orphans hanging out all over the place. So those are some issues with this particular project that are something you want to think about. Again, here the baseline grid doesn't work. So and notice how the bottom alignment on both of these is weird. She probably could have fixed that baseline alignment by simply bringing that text to the bottom. So those are things I want you to think about. Let's see. So again, these little black boxes picked up here, picked up there. She introduced that block quote with the black quote mark on the outside, and then picked that up here, both black, but that's okay. It works. Some of these graphics probably should have been larger. I mean, if you're going to talk about a logo design, you definitely want to make it, work. So a situation like this where she's starting to kind of be a little bit informal with her grid, like the branding is sort of floating in the middle of nowhere. Um, so those are some things you want to think about. Okay. So that's that particular design. And here it is without the grid. So it holds together. I mean, without the grid, it really kind of cleans the whole design up. Makes it look quite a bit nicer. So here's the white quote mark just sort of hanging out with the black quote mark there. So I think that was something she fixed in this final layout. Here we have some contrast issues with the text in the black boxes. It's a little weird what happens there. So that's a little bit looking like a mistake. Here, I think she fixed that here. I don't know, it's hard to say. This wanders a little bit. She has a grid line. I can't draw on that. But she has an alignment here that doesn't align there. And she has an alignment over here that's obvious. Why not just scooch this graphic over to there? So again, we'll talk a lot about creating more strong alignment possibilities based on your grid and what you use in your grid lines and what you choose not to. And so we got Stefan Segemeister, and he was a kind of an edgy designer and did a lot of really kind of, provocative. And so this is a situation again where the text runs over the image, and here we have what we call legibility issues, right? It's difficult to decipher what that text is because the background's so busy. There was very little she could have done about that except make the text white, which is what she should have done. Indeed, it would have been probably better to not run the text through the image and just run the text from the top and then through the bottom, and possibly made it a little bit smaller so that it would fit. One of the things that we want to be careful of when we're dealing with artists' work or designers' work is to not muck it up by overlapping or cropping in odd ways. The designer had a reason for doing what they did, and we are kind of bound to honor that decision. Here, this background would have been something she could have easily picked up in this design, especially with this text that really doesn't do anything except act as a texture. It would have been okay to take a background and put it behind that because this doesn't do anything anyway. Okay, so that's something to think about. And it could have even been something where it just would have been a column of that texture. It doesn't have to span the whole page or the whole spread. And it would have been something that would have been, again, picked up and then carried through. So here it looks like the baseline grid's handled pretty well. Here, picking up on an initial cap here, it would have been something appropriate to pick that up somewhere at the beginning, even unorthodox with the view being larger. It's just a good idea if you're going to be making something that is making a graphic statement to introduce it at the beginning so that it creates that continuity from the beginning to the end instead of introducing it halfway through. So there's continuity issues with this particular design, but the space is used nicely. Nice white space around there. The quote here is introduced here. It would have been cool maybe if Stefan Segemeister had been on an angle too, so that it would have kind of picked up on those three angles. So again, those are things that you want to think about as you are working through your design. And then we have Paula Scherer. And she's a pretty fun designer. She has a lot of, I wouldn't call it loose, I would call it energetic. Excuse me. It's funny. That's a great quote. And so she picked up on her style. I think this is stylistically very accurate in terms of how Paula would have designed this spread. If you look at her work, you'll see that she has a lot of very playful, very energetic designs. She uses color a lot. And if you do pick a designer that uses color, you want to be careful that you don't overuse it. You want to do it in a subdued manner. I think this design layout really picks up, again, the designer style. So if we're talking about picking that up, I think this designer did a really great job doing that. So and again, picking up on the scale and size of the graphics, the little flag, the folio in the corner. These are all things that I think she held together very nicely. This design probably would have benefited from a justified text, but considering Paula's sort of loose style, it works. One of the things that you might consider doing is if you're doing something like this, let me finish the thought. I'm not sure how appropriate it is for a lot of designers, but sometimes you can really accentuate the ragged edge of the type by putting in a forced line break or forced line breaks. And some of the lines are long and some are short, and you're accentuating that fact. Again, we got a whoops, right? So those are little orphans that you really, really, really want to avoid. The third spread, again, even though there's a lot of text, what she's chosen to do is to have the text size rather small. Now, keep in mind that, 7 to 8 point is considered a pretty comfortable type size for a magazine, but you will find it smaller, and so nothing less than 6. Okay, again, picking up on the pull quotes, which I think she started here, but didn't carry through here. So it would have been good if she's picking up something like this style, that it would have been picked up here, so that here it feels like it's still part of the design. Here, if we may have forgotten that it was introduced, and then we see it back here, and it still looks cool, but you want to just be aware that when you introduce a graphic style, that you want to carry it through. For example, she picked up the little folded paper, right? So that held together well. She introduces a graphic vertical and horizontal element here and here, but doesn't introduce it at all here. So again, something that it could have been under Paula, or it could have been meet with a line, could have been something, but it's important to remember that those are things that you want to think about as you move through your design. She did pick up the idea of, she didn't introduce it here. She did a little bit here. Should have been gray though, right? Because she's using the gray, and then she's using the gray. So it would have been good to put gray there. Again, that would be something that would, be a little bit more continuous. And it might have even been a little bit bigger. Since this is on a vertical, it's hard to read. And so sometimes it might be better if that would have been larger and a little more bold, so that we could read it without trouble. Something else about vertical type, it tends to read better if it's all in caps. All lowercase is really hard to read vertically, no matter what the typeface. Okay, so keep that in mind. Got some captions. Something weird going on there. Okay, I think I talked about that. If you're doing paragraph breaks, there's 2 ways of doing it. The first way, of course, is to indent, and the second way is to have a line break. And if you have a line break, you don't need to indent. Okay, and the third way is to not have any breaks, not an indent or even a line break, but you put a graphic element of some kind between the 2 paragraphs, and then you run it as a big block of text. So that's another way of handling paragraph body text. Okay. And we have Armin Hoffman. And here's the grid for Armin Hoffman. It's formal. Here's your binding edge in there. It's a very straightforward grid. So it's difficult to, I mean, this doesn't give you a lot of options because the 3 columns and the 4 rows, it just doesn't have a lot of possibilities. So that's something you want to think about. This design is a little overdone in my eye. Armin Hoffman was a very clean, very, well, he was one of the Swiss designers. And so something that is as busy as this would be something he might not do. But I think she was trying to pick up on one of the things that he had done. And so that's what she was trying to pull off here. So, you know, after picking up that very strong vertical element and then not carrying that through, that's a mistake. So you don't want to do that. You know, here, picking up on a big giant letter form, now that's something that would be appropriate as a element that you might do on the front page. You know, these little textured letter forms is kind of cool. He did a lot of this stuff, and it would have been fun to sort of see a little bit more of the, I shouldn't have closed that window. Oh, well. The sort of the graphic vertical and horizontal elements that are broken up, and she didn't really pick up on that on the opening spread. Or I should say he. This is a guy. Here, the idea of picking up text inside of a shape, that's fine. Here, I think it would be better to have the text be justified. You've got a strong column right there. This wanders off, and that sets the column pretty strongly, so it would be something where you'd want to do that. Here's the same situation here, where it would have been better to, I think, have a justified text. Pull quote pulled out there, and then I'm going to just slide this over to the side. And then from here, what ends up happening with this design is it ends up being just a little busy and a little confusing. You know, we now introduce another type style and another type size. That throws us off a little bit. We didn't see that here, right? So now all of a sudden we've got this body text that's too big. Introducing this 2-color text. We see a little teeny bit of that in this page here and here, but it's just barely there. So it would have been better to pick that up in a little more strongly in that previous spread. Orange on gray, great combination, but not so much with text and graphic. Okay, so we got some issues there. You can see his design. You know, it's super clean and very, very, very organized. Even though we have some rough edges, you can be sure that if you pick this up, started studying it, you'd see that there'd be some sort of structure there. You can see his clean design here. It's very, very, very Swiss. So I feel like she missed the mark on this. I feel he missed the mark on this design. It just lacks a lot of continuity. There's a lot of neat things going on, but, you know, he needed to edit. You know, there's just too much happening. So you need to kind of think about what you've got going. And again, you don't need to see the guy's name again. We've already seen that. And we see that again here, right? You don't need to see that again and again and again. Once you introduce the guy's name or the person's the you don't need to, you know, bring it back. So I think that's our last design. It is. So there's a quick overview of some of the designs. These are a little more current. The ones we looked at in class were a little older, and so I think these are a little more appropriate in terms of what we're doing. Okay, so I hope this video helps.